Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to start setting up our data classes and by extension, our database. Now we'll be using Entity Framework, which is Microsoft or .NET Core's flagship object relational mapper, or ORM for short, and they allow us to actually model our database classes or our database tables rather as C# classes, and then engineer our database based on our class definitions. So what we're going to be doing to get things started is creating a new folder in our project. So just right click, go to add and click new folder. I will just call this data. Now inside data, we're going to start putting in our classes. So our hotel listing, or well, API will really, just for educational purposes, only have two classes or two tables, one for the country and one for the hotel. So basically, when we look for a country, we should be able to see all the hotels that are associated with said country. That's basically the idea that we're going for. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and right click data, click add, and our first class will be country. So notice I'm going to name it in a singular fashion, country. The next one would be hotel. So each class represents one unit, a country and a hotel. Before we start defining the fields for either, I just want to get all the files in place, and then we can just work our way back and see how everything ties in. So after we have defined our classes, at least these two, I want to just go ahead and create what we call our DB-Context class. All right, so I'm going to call it DatabaseContext and go ahead and add that. And then this class is really going to represent our bridge between our defined classes or our entity classes and the actual database. So country, that's an entity that's going to be forward engineered into a table, right? Whatever we define as fields, we'll soon double back and do that. But whatever fields we put in country will be fields in a table called whatever we call it. So we're going to call the table countries because the table is effectively a collection of records of type country. The same goes for hotel, and the same will go for as many other entities / tables as you may have to define. So this is what we call code first engineering, where we actually write out the code for how we think our tables should look and then forward engineer or make adjustments to the table accordingly. So after creating this database context, we need to kind of outfit it with things that it needs to know that it is the bridge to the database. So the first thing that it needs to know is that it inherits from DB-Context. Now, this is going to give an error because I need to go and fetch some tools. But then when I control dot, you'll see Visual Studio suggesting that you install the missing package, which is Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. If you're not seeing this prompt, no problem. You can always just go right click the project, go to manage new get, and then you can search for the same package. Just go to browse and type in the package name and you would see it listed there. So either one works. But while I'm here, I'm just going to get all of the libraries from here that I know I'm going to need. So I'm definitely going to need this library. So I'll just download that one. And once again, I know I'm definitely going to need the driver for SQL Server because we'll be using SQL Server databases. That being said, there are other ones for other database engines. So you can use SQLite. I've seen Postgres. I'm not seeing it listed here, at least not immediately, but they're all here. So we'll be using SQL Server. So I'll go ahead and get that one. And the final one that we're getting, at least for this period, is the set of tools because we need the tools to be able to run some commands in the future. So I'll just go ahead and install that one also. All right, so now that we're done in NuGet, if you just want to check over in the installed, if you clear the filter, you'll see everything that you have installed. That's fine. So I'm going to go back to my DB context, and then I'm going to control that again, and then the prompt now changes to include the using statement because we already have the library at this point. Now inside of our repository, our database context, what we need to do is define a constructor. So I'm going to say public database context, or I could have just done ctor tab. There we go. And then I'm going to take the parameter db context options. So this will be passed down from the startup, but we haven't defined all of that yet. So we're just outfitting it right now. And then what I need to do is also initialize the base constructor for the DB context to take the same options. For now, we don't need to put anything else inside of the constructor, so we can just leave that blank and move on. So I did say that this represents the bridge between our application and our database. So it is here that we actually list out what the database should know about when it is being generated. So in shorter terms or more practical terms, I'm going to say public DB set, give this DB set a data type, which in this case could be country. And then I'm going to give the property a name, which would be countries. So the name that you give it here is the name that the database will use. So the data type as far as C# is concerned is country, but then the database is going to define a table called countries. And whenever we're accessing it, we'll access it as countries. So that is a minor thing. Yeah, I mean, everybody has their own naming convention. Some people use a command letter for their table names. I don't like to do that. I like to keep my table names plural and the data type singular, because this is one country, but then this is a collection of countries. After all, it is a DB set. It's a set of countries, right? No matter how you want to justify it, that's my justification. Once again, context rules everything. So I'll do the same for hotel and hotels. So there we go. Now, after doing all of this, we need to let our app settings know about the connection string. So the connection string is basically just, as the name suggests, a string that outlines how to get to the database that the application needs to connect to. So what I'm going to do here is create a new section, and see it's automatically giving me connection strings, right? And inside there, I'm just going to call this, let's call it SQL connection. And SQL connection is going to have server equals, and we have a local DB that is kind of built into Visual Studio. So at this point, you may have your own database that you want to use. If not, and you're a beginner and you're just following along, then you may use this one. That's default. You don't have to do any more installation actually. It's already included with your Visual Studio installation. However, at this point, if you have like an SQL server, whether it's localhost or, the IP address, that's what you would put in as a server value instead of what I have here. All right. But continuing, we also define a database name. So the database that we should look for / create, I'm going to call it hotel listings. Well, hotel listing underscore DB. All right. So that's the name of the database that I would like to interact with on that server. And then just one more very important or relatively important option, which is integrated security, and I'll just say equals true. So that's what our connection string looks like. So everything will come together after a while. We're just doing it bit by bit and building up to when everything is integrated. So our next step is to go over to our startup. So I did say that when we define the context, it's getting its options from the startup. So the startup needs to know that when the application starts, it should be loading its database configuration from here and using this file as the bridge. All right. So what we're going to do is add a new section. Actually, let me just reorder this a bit. So I like to add controllers as last or near to the last thing I do in configure services. So I like to do everything else before I add controllers. So you can just go ahead and move that line. So services dot add DB context. All right, so I call the database context. The code, the function says it's looking for a DB context. And then what it expects is something of type DB context. So this is of type DB context. This is my DB context that I'm creating. So I'm going to pass that in as that data type is looking for. Of course, including any missing references. There we go. And then here's the part, options. Right? So we have that little lambda initializer that we're used to by now, or it's not foreign to us by now. So for options, I'm going to say use SQL server. All right, and remember that when we're in NuGet just now, I had included that SQL Server library. So if I just control that, you see here, it's saying include that using statement. All right, so use SQL Server, and then it's going to want to know, okay, so where am I getting the configuration from? So I'm going to say configuration dot get your connection string. Get connection string. There we go. And then this is automatically going to look at app settings. So it says get connection string because it already knows that there might be a section for connection strings. And I'm saying get the connection string with that name. So you can actually define multiple connection strings here. You just need to comma separate them, and each one needs to have its unique name. And at that point, you could actually configure different database contexts for different databases in the same application, which could come in handy if your API needed to span multiple databases. So there are a number of benefits to having an API because it's not limited to one database and one set of interactions, right? So get connection string, I'll go ahead and pass in that name, closing all the braces that need to be closed. And for now, I believe that we have everything. Later on, we'll come back and modify this when we need some other functionality added. But for now, okay, I add an extra semicolon, so there we go. So for now, we have all we need. Now, before I move any further, I'm just going to double back and we're going to complete our class definitions. So we have hotel and we have country. So country, and I'm just going to say prop tab is going to have an ID. So entity framework says if you create a field called ID, I'll automatically assume that this is the primary key. All right, so you have two options. You can say ID or you can say the entity name ID. It will automatically say, okay, well, I'll just use this as a primary key. All right, so ID right there, that one is the key. And let's say a country also has a name. So country name and one more. So I just use Control D to duplicate that line. And we say maybe area or short name. Let's just do short name. So in my case, the first country that I would put in is Jamaica, and the short name would be JM. And then based on the country, of course, the short name is different, right? So those are the fields that I expect the country table to have when the database is generated. So I'm going to save that one, and I'm going to look at hotel now. So to start off, we can take ID and name because, I mean, we'll have to have the primary key. Every hotel has a name, but then I have some other fields here, including address, which is string, the rating, which is a double, and then a foreign key reference to our country. So let me, explain this. So if you know about databases, you know that the primary key is a unique identifier for any given table. The foreign key represents a unique reference, or it may not be unique, but it is a strong reference to another record in another table. In other words, any hotel has to be in a country. So we have the hotel, we give it the name, its address, its rating, but then we let it know, we give an ID here that corresponds with a country ID. All right. So we have to define two fields. We have a data annotation here. So square brace foreign key, and you give it the name that you want. So you could actually give this foreign key field a different name if you wanted, right? You could manually put in your name, or in this case, I'm just going to give it the same name as the class that it's referencing. So name of whatever class, right? Then we have two properties. We have country as an object, and then we have country ID as an integer. So country ID is the hard reference. That's the ID value, the 1, the 2, the 3, etc. However, country represents the actual object, so we can include all the details here. When we look at a hotel, if we wanted to know the name of the country, all we have natively inside of hotel is the country ID, but then we can fill this object with all the details. So we can say hotel dot country dot whatever property it is that we wish to include in our data. So this is a nice and easy way to, one, create a foreign key reference to another table, and two, make sure that when we pull a query for a table that has foreign keys all over the place, we can include all the details right here without writing too many messy inner joins and having to jump through hoops to get included data. So now that we have all of these details defined, and let me just do a quick run through just to make sure we're all on the same page. We have our folder called data, in which we're going to be storing all of our domain or database related objects and code. All of that will be stored inside of this folder called data. Later on, we can look at maybe putting it in its own project, but for now, it's just 3 files or a few number of files, so we don't need to do all of that. So data has a file called country, which is defining our countries table, and one called hotel, which is defining the hotels table. We also have the database context, which is inheriting from DB context courtesy of Entity Framework Core, which is once again acting as our bridge between our data classes and the actual database. All right. How does it get to the database? Well, one, we have the connection string that defines where to look, what to look for, and yes, look for it securely, right? So that is our connection string. Otherwise, at startup, we want to add the DB context or add that bridge to the database courtesy of this file. And this file should be using this connection string. Okay, sorry, I just had one extra brace, so I just removed it. All right, so let us do a quick build before we proceed to engineer our database. And to do a build, you can do hold down Control Shift and press B, or you can go to build here and build solution. But we have a successful build, so let's go over to the package manager console. If you're not seeing it there, you can always go to tools and new package manager and package manager console. All right, so here is where that Entity Framework Core.tools library comes in handy, because it allows us to run certain commands here to facilitate the scaffolding, and that's what it's called, scaffolding the database, right? The generation of the database. We have to run certain commands. So what we have to do is first add what we call a migration. So I'll say add dash migration. And if you start typing and you press tab, it will kind of autocomplete. And then I'll say creation. Let's say database created. All right. So we add migration, database created. So this is basically going to generate like a manifest or a preliminary file to say that it is generating, and see, I'm getting an error. So this is good. It's good when we see these errors and we work through them, because sometimes when we go through perfectly, we don't know what might happen. All right, so this error has to do with the country property in the hotel class, and I believe that it was just the ordering. So what I've done is to reorder it. So I had the ID underneath the property. That's what it looked like initially. So I'm just going to reorder it by taking the property, the integer property, and putting it directly underneath the annotation for a foreign key and moving that down. So as you can see, it can be sensitive. Order matters with some things. So let's see if this works. So I'm just going to rerun this command, add migration, and we are getting a completely different vibe where it is saying build started, succeeded, and it's letting us know that if we want to undo, we can run this, which means it has been done, right? So here we have our migration file, and then we see that we got a new folder called migrations, and what it does is take snapshots of each instance of the database. So at this point, we're defining our table countries with these column attributes and these properties. And if you look at it closely, I don't want us to analyze it too much because it can be overwhelming. But if you look at it as somebody who is familiar with the C# language, you realize that it's not saying anything out of the ordinary. It's saying we have a table, or we're creating a table, right? The name of it is countries based on what we define in the DB context, right? Countries. The columns in the table should be ID, which is a column of type int, and we're defining it as identity to increment by 1, right? That's all it's really doing. Name is a string, which should be defined as varchar, because in SQL Server, a string is really varchar, and short name varchar, right? There could be controls that we could put around maybe the size and if it's nullable, right? But then those are things that we can look at later on. Ultimately, though, we see here that we have our migration and it looks good. So the next step would be to actually create the database. All right. So what we'll do is go back to our package manager console and run update-database and give that a few. And then when it is done, it will let us know with a simple done. So how do we check? How do we verify? So you can go over to the SQL Server Object Explorer. I have it open here. If you don't have it there, you go to View and you choose SQL Server Object Explorer. So in the Server Object Explorer, we go to the very server that I did say was built into Visual Studio, which is localDB /MS SQL localDB. All right. So you can expand that, go to databases, and then you will see the database listed there. So hotel listing DB, and when we drill down, we'll see our countries. You'll also see that they're tracking all of the migrations happening. So each time you make a change to the class, let's say somebody came and said, oh, we need to extend country, we need to put on dialing code, right, or area code, whatever it is, then you add a new field, you create a new migration, you update database, you will create one more file like this to say this is the change to be made, and then update database will go ahead and make those changes on your behalf. That's good in a development environment. In a production environment, not so much. There will be far more controls around how updates to the database are handled. But for now, when we're building from scratch, it's good to understand how to do so efficiently. So that's it for now. What we did today was we defined our data classes, our domain classes. We set up our DB context. We did all of this from scratch. All right. And that's good. It's good to understand how everything connects. So we have the database context, the classes or the DB sets and the respective names. I remember whatever you call the properties here, that's what the table will get called. If you need to undo the migration, it becomes a bit tricky, because if you just do remove migration, you will get an error where it will tell you that the migration has already been applied. So you would have to revert this change to the database on a whole, which, since it's in the young stages, you might as well you could actually just go and delete the database, make your changes, create a new migration, and do an update database, right? So if you delete the database, then entity framework won't be telling you that something has been applied to a database that's not there. It would allow you to remove migration. You make your changes to whatever classes, then you do everything again, add migration, update, and then it would scaffold the database with your changes. Otherwise, if it is not as serious as removing a migration, you just wanted to add or remove something, you go ahead, make your changes to your domain classes accordingly. Then you add migration, update database, and it will take a snapshot once again at each point. So when we come back, we will look at how we can seed data into the tables, meaning when the migration happens, we just put data in before we even get into the API, because it's nice to have test data there before we start putting in data through our